All right, we're gonna get started. I need to try to be somewhat on time today.
High schooler.
Well, it's a what's the word? It's a compounding issue where if I come into worship late, then worship runs late, and then I'm late for confirmation. So I need to be as diligent as possible. Which is all relative for me, especially. Okay.
They could all pass away on this one. Because his was June 5th. Oh, okay. Emma's on there. So I'm going to remember, no, September.
Okay, sorry. Stream is up and going, I believe. Yep, we're good to go. Yeah, that's what your wife said. Was it a, I've never been there.
I'll get to my dad.
Is it really? Huh. It's over in Gresham.
Yeah.
Well, that's not far. All right, so I want to clarify something from last week, which this is what always happens when I get a chance to actually think about it for a little bit. So we were having a conversation last week where I was surprised because I was articulating, when I grew up, there was this kind of prevailing narrative amongst Christianity, especially evangelical Christianity, this idea of like the persecution of Christianity due to the rise of the secular world, which you all said you had no experience of. In fact, I was talking with Jackie after the class, and she was saying, yeah, it was the exact opposite. We were reminded again and again how good we have it, right? And we shouldn't complain about anything. And it was a great conversation, but I think the thing that I was trying to articulate, which I don't know if it came across, is how we identify ourselves, or how we associate ourselves. And this is actually going to come up in spades in the sermon text today, but I don't want to spoil that. But what I was trying to articulate is that because Christianity was historically persecuted, there is an assumption that Christian traditions, communities, denominations, assumptions maybe that aren't heard, but there's often an attempt to claim the importance of that. And this is, I think, a valid thing. I think, that the persecution of Christianity shaped Christianity, which is what we're going to talk about today. It shaped it extensively. Okay. But one of the complications of that, especially in post-World War II America, is the way in which we have blurred the lines between Christianity and America, right? This idea of America as a Christian nation. And so, when we try to claim this heritage of persecution, we simultaneously are trying to, again, it's not necessarily intentional. It's this subconscious thing. We're inadvertently, perhaps, claiming that the persecution of America and the persecution of Christianity go hand in hand. When what we're going to see as we read through this, as we look through, especially the first or the second and third centuries of Christianity and its conflict with the Roman Empire, if you were to do an association of characters, what we're going to find is that what the Roman response is to the rise of Christianity often is eerily similar to the ways in which our nation has responded to minorities and immigration, in fact. And so, you know, that's the danger of blurring the lines between these two things, right? Because we need to be able to critique. We need to be able to say, no, that's not how it be, right? You know, even and especially when our nation, which is nothing more than, you know, the collection of our citizens, you know, doesn't necessarily do something that our Christian identity would say is not good, right? Okay. But leave that for the sermon. Let's actually get to brass tacks. So we talked about Nero, crazy dude. You know, the whole, you know, lighting people on fire to illuminate his garden parties, obviously pretty nutso. And again, that was one of those things where if you would have asked me, is that really true or is that a quote-unquote tradition? I probably would have said it's probably a tradition, no way. But in fact, no, that's one of the things that has been independently verified by different sources from that time period, is that he did awful things with human beings. Okay, Nero gets deposed in 68, I think it is, commits suicide. He's out of the picture. There's a brief scramble for power where they have like 4 emperors at one point. A guy named Titus eventually emerges the victor. Titus reigns for a number of years. During Titus's reign, Christians are basically ignored, which kind of makes sense. They had enough problems going on they had enough enemies amongst themselves to point the blame at. They didn't need to pick on Christians anymore. And then comes a guy named Domitian, which I think we talked briefly about last. I can't remember where we left off. Domitian comes in the year 81. And here's what's important about Domitian. Is Domitian, and I'll write, I'm not good at pronouncing Latin names. Domitian. I don't know how. Anybody teach Latin in school? I'm going to say Domitian. That's what makes sense to me. Domitian's old school, and he comes in on the heels of an emperor that basically seized power out of chaos. And I invite you to think creatively, even from like a contemporary standpoint. What might the goals and drives of that leadership be, right? What might the rhetoric that they're using be, right? So here's this empire that is thrown into chaos. The guy that reigns in the wake of the chaos is kind of just a placeholder. I mean, that's not true at all. But really, his reign is probably defined by the fact that he's the one that won out of the scuffle, right? And here comes the next guy, right? So what's he trying to do? Is he trying to establish a legacy? Is he trying to return Rome to peace and prosperity? Yeah, maybe, yes, all of those things, okay? So Domitian comes in and immediately starts throwing rocks in the water, so to speak. So we're going back to the year 70, which is a decade before this, and that marks the destruction of the temple. So the immediately following Nero's deposition, that's not the right, even though that works, it's not the right word. His deposing, what's that? What is the nominalization of depose as depose a ruler in order to distinguish it from what you do when you take the statement of a witness? You depose a witness and you take a deposition, but when somebody is deposed, do you call that deposition? Okay, sorry. Sorry. Grammar moment. Disposed, since they were disposed. I like that. That's a good one, Jill. Sorry, we'll refer to that as a grammar squirrel. So, temples destroyed in 70 due to the Jewish-Roman wars. When Domitian comes in, he decides that we need to tighten the screws down on the Jewish population. Not to mention offset the money that we wasted fighting the war. And so, since it's 11 years since the destruction of the temple, and this fits beautifully into today's sermon text, by the way, is give to Caesar what is Caesar's, right? Which, spoiler, is what comes down to is should you pay the temple tithe, or should you pay the tax to the emperor, or both, right? Which is the question that's being proposed to Jesus. Sorry, you're going to hear this again in the sermon, but in the days of Jesus, the way that this worked was the temple tax is literally the tithe that's paid to the physical temple, right? To the building of the temple, because that was how Judaism understood itself. It was it was temple Judaism. As long as the temple is there, that's the house of God. That's where we derive our authority from, right? And you pay to the temple to support the Levites, it's no longer Levites, but to support the priests who are taking care of the temple and the tabernacle and the ark, etc. Does that make sense? Okay. So the temple is destroyed. 11 years later, Domitian is like, well, why are they paying money to the temple? It's not there anymore. They should give that money to Rome, right? And he's got very good reasons for it. And I imagine that was probably a pretty popular decision amongst Roman citizens, right? Like, yeah, they've been skimping out on their taxes this whole time. They should be paying their fair share. Just like, see how good I am at this, right? I'm gonna campaign. I don't know what for. County park administrator. So he says, let's refill imperial coffers. The Jews should give an annual offering to Rome instead of to Jerusalem. Guess what happens? Many of them refuse. Because it's not just about the temple, it's the idea itself, right? So some refused, some did send the money, but made clear that they were sending it to Rome, but it did not take the place of their tithe to the temple. So we'll pay your tax, but we're still paying our tax, thumbing their noses at them, okay? So what does this do? This ticks Domitian off, okay? And so what he does is he starts to tighten the screws down further. And he starts to use harsher language with regards to the Jews being anti-citizens, right? Being against. I mean, this is what's fascinating, is we'll actually see this in Domitian's persecution of Christianity as well. They're against humanity. They're against humanity because Rome represents the known world and is the caretaker of humanity, and to act against Rome is to act against human beings. Interesting how that works out, right? So, starts to tighten the screws, begins a new persecution, starts out with Judaism, but again, because Christianity has yet to distinguish itself from Judaism, other than being, again, perceived by Rome, a Jewish cult, right? Christians get lumped in with the Jews. And pretty soon, they become the primary target of Domitian's persecution. So, the Christians originally start out getting persecuted because they're caught in the crossfire, but later on, they become the easier target because of their lingering unpopularity due to Nero's persecution, okay? Something important to remember here, and I mentioned this last week, but it's true of pretty much every major persecution, is that all of the major persecutions up until the big one at the end of the 3rd century are very localized. So most of these are happening purely in Rome. It doesn't mean that elsewhere in the empire there isn't some small stuff going on, but from a historical record, it doesn't. The ripples don't extend much further past this, which makes sense. One of the things that we struggle with is that our world is so small due to the internet, right? Due to the ability to transmit information. We expect that, we know as soon as something happens in Israel or happens in China, we know instantly what's going on. Not so in the Roman Empire, right? Despite the ease of travel and the relative ease of communication, especially due to the empire and its infrastructure, it still took time. And when things take time, the sense of immediacy and the sense of wow, it's happening here doesn't occur. Do you remember when the world used to be like that? Right? For those of you who lived through the things that happened before my time, before the internet was available, how long it took communication or information to spread, right?
We had to wait till Walter Cronkite came on in the evening.
Because news wasn't on 24 hours a day. You had to wait for the evening news of Walter Cronkite.
CNN was a big thing when that came on.
The 24-hour news network. Yeah.
Huge.
Curse you. Yeah.
I was in the military in the 60s, and you were over across the Pacific, you'd get a letter, 7 days, it was the best you'd get,
Wow.
and from when it was written, then you'd answer it, it would take 7 days.
7 days to get back.
And then they'd respond 7 days later. So the turnaround was over half a month of trying to keep track of what you said and what the response was. I said, when did I say that? What are they talking about? I have no idea.
But this is the fascinating thing to me about, you know, understanding the revolutions in modern warfare, right? You know, the fact that you can instantaneously transmit orders and information is just, you know, such a game changer as well too. I mean, you know, so think about back. Sorry. I gotta be careful. I gotta be careful what I say. But when you relied on the newspaper to tell you what had happened nationally, right? How many of your parents perhaps saved the moon landing newspaper, right? Because that's how you found out that it happened. It wasn't on Twitter the moment after, you know, Neil Armstrong landed. I mean, shoot, 2023, the next moon landing we get, it will be live streamed. I guarantee it. It will be live streamed. We will be able to watch with an 8-minute delay an astronaut step foot in the moon, right? Crazy. So the point being here is that, yeah, most of these persecutions were localized because when it takes, well, 7 days, but probably more in this era to transmit information from Rome to the ends of the empire, which was, you know, constantly in flux where that was, it wasn't as big of a deal. Oh, that's happening in Rome. But also, not everybody heard about this stuff, right? There was no newspaper being printed.
Pigeons didn't fly that far.
Yeah, pigeons didn't fly that far. I mean, these are the days of town criers and, you know, information being posted.
I have a question. At that point in history, how many of the Jews had been dispersed or forced out of Israel and were in Europe and other areas that
Yeah,
would affect?
that's a good question. It takes a lot of time, right? So we talked about the diaspora in the beginning of this class. And I may have led to the assumption that it happens overnight after the end of the Jewish-Roman wars. But in reality, it takes decades, it takes centuries. The diaspora, as we understand it, happens over a long period of time. And it's kind of this gradual thing where, you know, with the destruction of the temple, there isn't the destruction of the temple, not to mention persecution and the general unfriendliness. There's not a good reason to you know, keep roots there. I mean, I'm really oversimplifying a more complex, but it's human migration, right? Why do we move anywhere? What keeps us in a place? So to answer your question directly, no, there's still plenty of Jewish people living in Israel during this time. Diminished persecutions, I'm sure, affect that as well too. You know, cause some migration. You know, it's a fascinating question. You know, if only we, you know, Roman censuses are okay, but they don't happen every year. But if only we had, you know, the information that's available to us today, where we could literally track the migratory paths. That sounds awful. We could track the movements of Jews. I would love to see that map, right? I would love to see that information. How long it takes, but that kind of polling data doesn't exist, right? Yeah. So one of the catch-alls that Domitian uses in his persecution is he wants to tighten down on anybody doing quote unquote Jewish practices, which is basically how Christianity gets lumped into it, right? Is that from an external perspective, there really isn't much differentiated between those two peoples, right? So Domitian kind of extends that persecution to Christianity, and so there's a couple. And the reason that this is important is that they're a Roman couple who end up being accused of quote-unquote Jewish practices and consequently atheism, right? Because again, the Jews and Christians believe in an invisible God, right, and in a monotheistic God, whereas the Romans have the pantheon where our gods are very visible. The statue of Zeus is right down there, and you know, whatever. So, very different world. So Flavius Clemens and his wife Flavia Domitilla are accused of Jewish practices. This is really interesting, right? Accused of Jewish practices. Has there ever been a time in our history where people have been accused of certain practices. I'm thinking of the McCarthy era, you know, the blacklisting, accused of communist practices, right? Humans do these things, right? So here are these two people, whether or not they were Christians, they're neighbors, potentially bearing a beef, and these are wealthy people probably, are accused of Jewish practices and atheism. And so they're executed. They are arrested, and I don't know whether there's a trial or not, but they are recorded as being essentially the first martyrs of the Domitian persecution. And what's fascinating is the leaders in the church at the time are shocked. They can't believe it. They're so surprised that this would happen. They were pretty secure. Well, you know, maybe they're persecuting the Jews. It's not going to happen to us. And yet here are these two supposed Christians who are persecuted. And what happens throughout the rest of Domitian's reign is this continues. Continues to basically be the modus operandi of Domitian. People are primarily in Rome, you know, rounded up, accused of Jewish practices. Now there is no great pogrom, right? There's you know, the Roman soldiers aren't going through the streets looking for Jews and Christians. It's primarily people who are being accused by their peers, right? It's like the Salem witch trials almost. Crazy, crazy stuff. The reason why Domitian's reign is important is, guess who writes a letter to 7 churches in Asia Minor during Domitian's reign? John of Patmos, okay? And this is one of the most important pieces for me that we can point at when talking about Revelation as a text, right? Really, a lot of it depends on your denomination and how you read the Bible. Amongst mainline Protestant Christianity, we pretty much unanimously understand Revelation to be a letter written in this context. And so what John of Patmos is writing about is not about some great cosmic battle that's going to happen in the year 2000 because we forgot to change the date on something and solve a computer crash. What John is writing about is he's writing about the persecution that Christians are experiencing due to Domitian's reign in the Roman Empire. And he's writing about how Christ will be victorious even against that, right? And when we studied Revelation, I guess it was 5-6 years ago, we should probably go through it again at some point. You know, one of the things that we pointed out was how much of the imagery in Revelation is a mockery of Roman imperial imagery. It's intentional, right? So that's why this is important. Again, both Nero and Domitian's persecutions were, you know, I'm repeating myself, limited essentially to Rome and weren't very far-reaching. But a lot of this, you know, just like, you know, all human problems, it sows the seeds as well too, right? So successive emperors will look back at these previous precedents, and people will look back and say, too, all those Christians, they were responsible for the Great Fire. They're the ones that refused to pay taxes to Rome. They're anti-Rome, they're anti-human, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And wait, there's more. Do I want to talk about this right now? Or do I want to come back to this? Now let's do that segue. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead. So there's a couple of really interesting, sorry, I'm scrolling through my book. There we go. There's a couple of really interesting stories that come out of the 2nd century. Something to remember, or kind of a way of understanding the 2nd century of Christianity, is that by and large, you do not have great empire-wide persecution. You get flare-ups of this kind of stuff, okay? The people, well, it's kind of like every other emperor decides to reawaken this. One of the worst, believe it or not, is one of the most revered emperors of this era of Rome, Marcus Aurelius, right? Has anybody read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations? Yeah, good stuff, right? Fascinating stuff. Turns out he, like many people, did not practice what he preached, right? He talks about being, well, I don't know, it's been a long time since I read Meditations, but, you know, it's about reason being triumphing over, you know, he was a stoic, right? We talked about stoicism, but shockingly, Marcus Aurelius was ready and willing to persecute Christianity simply because the mob demanded it. So, reason kind of went out the window. And he, in fact, partly because of his desire to kind of return to Rome as Rome, supposedly used to be, saw Christianity as a great threat. It was also had to do a lot with class as well, too, which is what we're going to talk about now. This is the segue that I wanted to make. So, just as Christians are being accused and killed, similarly, there's a lot of rhetoric against Christianity that comes out towards the end of the first century and throughout the second century, right? And we talked about some of the rumors that were spread about Christianity. For example, my favorite, which is the idea that, sidebar. Christian worship, okay? We talked about how they would share in the love feast on Sundays and do fasting and whatnot. One of the things about this love feast is that in early Christianity, baptism was very, very important. Baptism was the indicator that you had been initiated into the Christian faith. Baptism did not happen whenever the family felt like it. It only happened on Easter Vigil. So, people who wanted to be baptized would join in initiation the year prior, and there would be a lot of stuff. I'm sure there was education, fasting, different ways in which they prepared for their baptism. And then they would fast all of Holy Week and be baptized on Saturday evening, on Easter Vigil. Sometimes, and then they would be baptized, and then they would get to then share in the love feast on Sunday morning, celebrating the resurrection, right? So one of the, it's kind of gatekeeping, but one of the rules was you couldn't participate in this feast unless you've been baptized. When does this come about? I don't know. We get it pointed out as happening definitely in the second century, but when does baptism become the requirement for participating in Christian community? Maybe early on, maybe not, I don't know. But we do know that that is the model that functions. So, one of the consequences of this is that on Sunday mornings, groups of Christians would gather together to share a meal, and you couldn't come in unless you've been baptized. Imagine the rumors that might be spread because of this. Secret gathering where they're sharing in the body and blood of their Lord. That's kind of weird, right? And so one of the rumors that came out, and this is my favorite, is that the way that they would trick people into becoming Christians is new initiates, those who have been recently baptized, would be invited to cut the bread into which a live infant had been placed. And then after they had inadvertently killed a child, they would not be willing to share the secrets of Christianity for fear of it being known what they did. And so this is the rumor, right? They're baking babies into bread and then eating them afterwards. That was also part of it, right?
It was like king cake.
King cake, one of our great French / New Orleans traditions, which galette de roi, the cake of the king, into which you place a small plastic figurine of an infant. It's 100%. I'm going to tell Len about that. She's going to laugh her head off. Yeah. Although they never, in France, they don't put a little plastic baby. They put a piece of macaroni.
Oh, cheating.
Mm-hmm. As far I don't know, that might have just been one of Len's family did, but that's great. So this is one of the more inflammatory rumors that spread, but it's not just about rumors, it's about criticism of Christianity in general. Because what's happening is it's growing despite these persecutions, or maybe because of these persecutions, the popularity of Christianity is expanding, but it's expanding primarily through the lower classes. So the people who are beginning to comprise Christianity are cobblers, bakers, what we would refer to in 2023 as blue-collar workers. These are the people for whom Christianity has appeal. And I would think that we can understand why that is, right? Christianity has always had fertile ground amongst the oppressed, right? And it should. It absolutely should. That's who Jesus, in the Gospels at least, comes to save. But you can understand where perhaps a lot of the slander or criticism of Christianity might come out of. It comes out of, well, it's those dirty, they wouldn't use this language per se, but it's those dirty peasants that have, don't have good blood in them, that are, that believe in this dribble, this nonsense about this one invisible God. Also, because what's happening is that many Jewish folks are leaving Israel and moving around and moving to Rome and other cities. It's those dirty immigrants, essentially, that are coming in and bringing this nonsense with them. And you can see where this rhetoric goes then further. Is, well, they're breeding with us, they're diluting good Roman blood, they're bringing these abominable practices, and I quote, abominable practices and ignorance with them is the way that Christianity is talked about. We see this at all in modern, well, not just modern, but in the history of the United States, but elsewhere. And what's remarkable is how ironic this is. So what happens as a result of this critique of Christianity during the 2nd century is we get people who come up that we refer to as apologists. It means a lot different than it does today. Today, this word is used by a lot of people who want to point out that Christianity is right over and against atheism. But what apologists were doing, which is hilarious, but that's a different story. What apologists were doing in the 2nd century is defending themselves against essentially the propaganda machine of the Roman Empire, trying to defend not necessarily why they're right, but why they're not bad.
Please don't kill us so.
Please don't kill us so. Stop killing us, right? We're not baking babies into bread. We're not anti authority. We're not trying to undermine your government. We're not we're not anti-human beings. So you get several people that end up writing extensively, essentially in defense of the Christian faith. What's fascinating about this is one of the ways in which early Christian theology begins to evolve. Is that as people are writing about it over and against the critique that they're getting, they're starting to refine a lot of the ideas that have been prior to this localized, right? Every community has its own flavor. They share texts, somewhat. Christianity arrives at a sense of common practice just kind of through natural evolution. But what happens during the 2nd century is as you've got people that are writing and sharing writings defending the Christian faith, it begins to normalize somewhat Christian theology, right? One of the most famous guys that comes out of this era is a guy named Justin in French. Justin, also known as Justin Martyr. Martyr is not his last name. It's because he's eventually martyred, and that becomes his identity, which is Justin Martyr. And he writes, I think, like 3 different treatises, which I can't remember the names off the bat. I can look them up. That are all about the defense of Christianity, but not just defense, articulating why Christianity is, quote unquote, reasonable, right? Because this is one of the major critiques that Marcus Aurelius makes, is that Christianity is ridiculous. He's very pro-reason, and Christianity makes no sense. And so Justin Martyr is like, no, dude, this is why it totally makes sense. Oh, you want to put them here? You want me to talk about it?
Yeah.
Okay, I will do that.
It's like all the information's there. You like put them up maybe and
We'll do that. Here's your first peek. Little Shop of Horrors is being put on by Milwaukie High at the Milwaukie Theater on November 2nd, 3rd, 9th, 11th, 4th, and 10th at different times. These will be going up in the hallway. So Aurelius is like, Christianity is ridiculous, and Justin Martyr is like, no, it's actually quite reasonable. Let me explain to you why. And so he writes these 3 treatises. He's not the only one. There are several people that come out of this era. Let me see if I can come up with a couple of names here. There's a guy named Athenagoras, a guy named Tatian. I'm sure you're going to remember these names and use them frequently in conversation. Martyr writes a book called Dialogue with Trypho, who was a Jewish rabbi. And that is important because that's one of one of his works that has survived to this day. Again, this is just trivia for you, but you understand what's going on here. What's interesting is the way in which also, many of these apologists were articulating really interesting stuff. So the way in which the Roman Empire referred to people that were kind of outside, where they called them barbarians, right? The barbarians in Gaul, the barbarians in Britain, right? The barbarians were the yet unconquered peoples. Well, they called Christians barbarians as well, too, right? Because they were not, think of all the identifiers that you can use, right? They're uncultured, they're uncouth, they mock our language, because many of them are Jewish, they speak Hebrew, they have weird cleanliness practices, they're obviously not good Roman citizens, right? Which ends up being ironic, especially after Christianity really weaves its threads throughout the empire. And so, okay. Sorry, I'm scrolling through a bunch of stuff. There's a lot of information here. But one of the things that Justin Martyr points out, which is an argument I find absolutely fascinating, is again, one of the major critiques was, well, these are barbarians, so they're people from the outside, literally and figuratively, right? Because in some cases, these are Jewish Christians coming from Jerusalem that are moving into Rome, bringing in, they're immigrants, right? Bringing in all these bad influences. But they're also argued to be cultural barbarians as well. Being Christian, doing Christian practices means that you are outside the civility of Rome, right? And again, considering that many of the people for whom Christianity was popular were the lower classes, it was also cultural barbarism as well, too, right? These are the people that, well, and these are the kind of things that continue to today. The New York elite versus the uneducated Southerners. I'm, throwing out tropes that we hear. Not that any of that's true. Justin Martyr points out how stupid this is. Because what Martyr says is that the reason that Rome is great is because of the things that it has brought into it. Because of the peoples and the ideas that it has absorbed. Mathematics. Hold on, I gotta find my list. I have a good list. Sorry, there's a great quote in here. No, I can't find my list. Anyways, I'll find it 5 minutes from now. We move on to a different topic. You understand the argument here. Okay, so the thing that I was laughing at is that the accusation against Christians of, hey, we're baking babies in the bread and stuff, one of the things that Martyr points out is, we're all pacifists, dude. We're against violence in general. Why in the heck would we kill babies and do all that crazy stuff? Okay. Now we're going to go back a little bit. Any questions so far? Any pieces? Sorry, I'm burning through information here. Eyes glazing over yet? Okay. Let's talk about Gnosticism. This is the fun stuff. Okay. Did we talk about this? Yeah, we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the apostles, I think. I can't remember. So with the rise of the apologists who are defending the Christian faith, one of the other things that happens is there is a desire to, again, maybe normalize is the wrong word, but to begin to have some consistency of belief. These churches, again, which are spread out all across the Roman Empire, from Rome to Asia Minor to Jerusalem, maybe perhaps as far as India, certainly throughout Western Europe, they're a long ways apart. And how do you guarantee consistency of teaching when you've got communities that might not hear from another Christian community for months, if not years, right? You don't. That's a lot of what Paul does in the first century. Paul is writing letters to churches, articulating what he understands to be the message of Jesus Christ, in the hopes, it's my childhood aversion to swearing coming out. Holy Christ. Paul's trying to essentially, articulate, evangelize. Here's who I know Jesus to be. Well, during the 2nd century, I erased what I was writing there, as the apologists are beginning to have that conversation in a more public manner, they're circulating their writings, which are intended not to convince other Christians, actually, but are intended to convince people who are against Christianity. They end up introducing topics of conversation amongst Christianity over, well, what do we really believe, right? The answer, it turns out, is not so easy. There's quite a bit of variation across theologies. And this is one of the really important things. As we get into talking about Gnosticism, there's a false understanding would be that, for example, Marcionism, which is, Marcion was the guy, I always confuse Marcion and Marian, whatever. I'll find out whether I'm right or wrong later. But Marcion, I think, is the guy who decides, let's ditch everything except the synoptic gospels, right? It's all bad. The rest, the Old Testament especially, presents this angry God. Only the 3 gospels and a couple of Paul's letters actually point to who Jesus actually is. Okay. There's a temptation to think that he just comes up with this out of nowhere, right? That all of a sudden one day, Marcion sits down, he reads it, and he's like, this is all rubbish. This is what I think is right. When in reality, a lot of it is due to the setting that we've just described, which is that Marcion, I'm sure, had people who were, yeah, man, Old Testament's tough. That God can be a jerk at times in the Old Testament. Why should we cling on to this? We're about Jesus, who's doing a new thing. We don't need those old Jewish practices, right? And you can see where this originates on. So, in a lot of ways, it's this emphasis on articulating the Christian faith that ends up leading to also a discussion around what's right and wrong. And Gnosticism means knowledge, okay? And Paul and I were talking about this in class some time ago. I don't remember how many or who was here for that conversation. But specifically what Gnosticism ends up being refined into is branches of Christianity that are professing to have secret knowledge, okay? Which sounds real Illuminati and stuff like that, but it's people who are claiming to know the right thing over and against others, which never happens in our modern world, right? We never disagree. We never have a church split because one side thinks the other is wrong. It never occurs. All stopped at the end of the 2nd century, right? No, so what's fascinating for me, is from the sociological aspect of this almost evolution of Christianity that happens via competition in some ways. It's really kind of almost a Darwinian thing where they end up having to kind of like essentially refine their message by cutting out pieces that weren't falling in line. Which I'll just say this can be dangerous, right? When you get to this like purifying practice and throwing out wrong theology, it can be bad. And at times it was. Because they weren't necessarily crucifying people or burning them at the stake, but they were making claims about their salvation. People who believe the wrong things. Well, you believe the wrong things, so sorry for you, but God doesn't want that kind of stuff. Okay, so Gnosticism coming from gnosis, which means knowledge, and again, the Gnostics didn't just disagree, but they thought they had the right knowledge. What's interesting is that we've had many alternatives. Well, how do I say this? With the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and other stuff ever since Dan Brown wrote his books, Curse of These. I've read most of them. They're funny. There's been a renewed interest in like the Gnostic Gospels, or for example, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas. Okay. What also happens during this time is that these things are written, right? Which is hard to communicate to somebody who comes to you and is like, but dude, haven't you read the Gospel of Thomas? totally critiques blah, blah, all the things that are wrong with Christianity. It's like, well, it was probably written during the 2nd century when people were professing to have secret knowledge. That was really just kind of a way of gatekeeping. And so these things were written as a way of showing that we have, it's like, pretty much invalidated. The Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas are examples of texts that come out of here. But what ends up happening is that shockingly, there ends up being I gotta be careful here, not necessarily a cooperation, but Gnosticism ends up moving in a specific direction. In other words, a lot of these groups that are professing to have secret knowledge end up kind of like unifying in the way that they think and they talk. So they're all claiming to have secret knowledge, but what ends up being the pinpoint argument, my metaphor's failing me here, right? So it's the wedge issue. I had to draw it out so I could think about it. Is around the what Jesus is, okay? And it has to do with the physical versus the spiritual. And it has to do with what's real, like matter, what is physical, what has matter versus what's ephemeral or, again, spiritual. Does that kind of make sense? Does that distinction make sense? And where the Gnostics are falling, the side that they're falling on is it's fascinating because it comes out of an anti-Stoic response. They are convinced that all matter is evil, which sounds like a real broad claim to make. But if we think about it more in terms of perhaps our Puritan ancestors, right? Sex is bad, dancing is bad, fun is bad, drinking is bad. It's kind of the same conclusion. So they're convinced that the physical world, this stuff, especially this stuff, fleshy bodies, right? That's evil. What is ultimately good is God, who is not physical, okay? And that seems somewhat innocuous, but is actually really, really troubling, especially considering the fact that Jesus was a human being with this stuff, right? And so the argument that ends up leading to is who actually was Jesus? Was Jesus the human being in the body? Or was Jesus some ephemeral spirit inhabiting a human host? It sounds strange. That escapes upon crucifixion, right? Abandoning the evilness of flesh. It sounds like an alien movie, right? It's Scientology in a nutshell, but that's a different conversation. They're going to come for me. That's on the internet. Oh, L. Ron Hubbard. This is why, I could make jokes about science fiction writers creating religion, but that's the point. So, matter's bad. Jesus escapes out of the flesh. But think about what this how this fundamentally affects then what they believe and what they practice. If this is all bad, what's the purpose? Get the heck out of Dodge, right? It's to escape this. Do you see how Gnosticism didn't die with Gnosticism? So Middle Ages, mortality is high due to war, famine, pestilence, all the things that ride the horses in Revelations. Generally bad, right? The Roman Empire has collapsed. What's the major question that people are asking their local priest? I'm probably not going to live super long. How do I make sure I get to heaven? How do I make sure I get to heaven? Upon which Catholic theology is essentially built, right? Catholic theology, that's a different conversation, but basically all this stuff around limbo and purgatory and all of this delineation of the afterlife, it's not stuff that we find in Scripture. It's stuff that people articulate as a way of answering these questions, and it comes out of this idea that, And I could totally understand it if you're a peasant living in like France in the 500s, where you're going to work until you die, which might happen when you're 30, or if you don't die from just your body giving out, you're going to die from the most recent plague that went through, COVID. Or you're going to get conscripted by some guy that wants to go back and capture the Holy Land. Yeah, I'm going to be really interested in getting out of this body, right? Which is full of pain and suffering. But do you begin to see how this then influences just how we think about things in general? Because what this leads to eventually is world is bad, heaven is good. And that the two are at odds with each other. And do you see how this influences, even yet today, the way in which we think about things? Yeah, this is theological. These are the people you got to blame for it, by the way. But again, I don't, it's easy to demonize, but I can understand where that comes out of, right? If you're living during a time when, if you're in Rome, you might get arrested and killed for no better reason than your neighbor is ticked at you because of the height of your fence. I would be really concerned as well about making sure I get to the right place. And if somebody comes to me and says, well, I've got the right knowledge to make sure that you get to the right place, that's going to be a very convincing argument. And if they then say to me, well, the problem in general is just this stuff's all bad, and you're looking around at you're seeing your friends get arrested, you're like, yeah, this is all bad. But then it leads to the idea that, well, God actually isn't interested in any of this. God is interested in this other world that exists over here, which we all need to escape to. And someday we're all going to escape to it. We're going to get vacuumed up into the sky, except for the other people that get left behind. See, yeah, right? Sorry, I'm talking really fast, but I'm also kind of joking. Here's where this ultimately leads to, and I'm really kind of doing a condensed version of Gnosticism, which we can talk more about next week. But here's where it comes to the Apostles' Creed and the Athanasian Creeds, right? Okay, let me pull up the Athanasian Creed real quick. And the Athanasian Creed does not, by the way, I want the text, I don't care about I should pull this up ahead.
Athanasius, what year is the Athanasian Creed? That's later, isn't it?
Much later. I'm trying to scour my memory. I don't know. I'll tell you later. But listen to the words here. Oh, this isn't the right one. Wikipedia. Hold on a second. Oh, there we go. Found it. Okay. Stop. I don't want to see your advertisement. Whosoever will be saved before all things, it is necessarily that he hold to the Catholic universal faith. And that has nothing to do with the Catholic Church. Which faith, except everyone do keep whole and undefiled, without doubt, he shall perish everlastingly. Whew. That's an introduction. And the Catholic faith is this. By the way, the Protestant version excludes that introductory text we start right at. We worship one God in Trinity, and Trinity in unity. Right? The 3 in 1, 1 in 3. Neither confounding the persons nor dividing the substance, but there is one person, emphasis on person, of the Father, another of the Son, and another of the Holy Ghost. The Godhead of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost is all one, the glory equal, majesty co-eternal. Can you hear the theological arguments in this text? Right? This is the evolution of trying to really narrow down on what exactly we believe. Such as the Father is, such is the Son, and such is the Holy Ghost. So in other words, they're all the same. The Father uncreate, the Son uncreate, and the Holy Ghost uncreate. The Father incomprehensible, the Son incomprehensible, and the Holy Ghost incomprehensible. The Father eternal, the Son eternal, and the Holy Ghost eternal, and yet they are not 3 eternals, but 1 eternal, and also there are not 3 incomprehensibles, nor 3 uncreated, but 1 uncreated, and 1 is incomprehensible. So like the Father is almighty. Okay, do we need to go through the whole thing? Okay, now we're going to... Yes, it is. I mean, in a lot of ways, and I don't mean to disparage the Athanasian Creed. Certainly it is important. But I want to go back. So when I was growing up in a Lutheran church, we would have communion when I was young every other Sunday. And this is, they don't think these things through, which I came to loathe communion Sundays serious, not because I dislike communion, but because the service was 15 minutes longer. Because not only did we have to go through the whole rigmarole of serving communion, which took forever, because we had a very small rail and we had to commune at the rail. So that meant like 4 people at a time could be commune. And even though our church was pretty small, 50 people 4 at a time takes forever. But also, on the Sundays that we did communion, we would change from the Apostles' Creed to the Nicene Creed, which made 0 sense to me. I'm like, why not offset, right? If the service is going to be longer, read the shorter creed. But no, we read the longer creed on the day of the service. So, Nicene Creed reads such as this, which we haven't read in a long time. I believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, born of the Father before all ages, God from God, light from light. These words sound familiar now. True God from true God, begotten, not made. What does that mean? Jesus was born. He wasn't fabricated out of nothing. Which means that what? Jesus is the body. Jesus is the fabric, right? Begotten, not made. Well, this is the Catholic version. Consubstantial with the Father. Come on, Catholicism. Through him all things were made. Okay. You now are. I greased my things, you dummy. You're now witness to something that happens in the 2nd century echoes throughout Christianity, and it all comes down to one simple thing: was Jesus a person? Did Jesus have a body? When Jesus was killed, was that him dying, or was there some other insubstantial spirit, hiding in his body that escaped? Were there actually 2 separate people? Right? Was there Jesus the body and Jesus the spirit? And so Jesus actually has 2 different identities, a body identity and a spirit identity. I mean, these are literally the arguments that people had for centuries. Right? This was the stuff that results in when the Nicene Creed is finally adapted in the 3rd or 4th century, right, at the Council of Nicaea, whatever. This is the argument that they're finally putting the nail in. They're finally putting a rest to. They think, right, until it rises again, and we got the Athanasian Creed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
I got a question.
Please.
So, if you think about the times these conversations were going on, when probably 99% of the people in the world were interested in, who was going to clear the back lot and whose son was going to serve in the army and how the roads are going to be maintained. What was the context of who are these people that are having these kinds of conversations?
But this, I know, right? Okay. This is the other piece that is occurring during this, is that, we talked about how Christianity, especially at the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd, was primarily composed of, what the empire perceives to be, blue-collar people. But as Christianity evolves, you get more and more people who are educated, right? People of means, people of power, right? Because the significance of this is when you fast forward another century, so the end of the 3rd century, where it really gets bad for Christianity, which we still haven't gotten to yet, but we'll get there. What marks the big difference in that persecution, the reason it's so bad, is it isn't just some random peasant off the street that's being accused of Christianity. It's people of power. And so the persecution at the end of the 4th century is the result of the evolution of Christianity, which has begun to include more and more diverse people. And, not just Jews who have fled and brought their religion with them, or people of the oppressed lower classes who find comfort and meaning in the words of Jesus. Now Christianity is a thing, right? And keep in mind, society. Again, I'm no expert on Roman society, but one of the things I do understand about it is that a person of means was a person of leisure until you needed to fight, right? But even then, you weren't up front in the phalanx. You were sitting back in the command tent, a lot of times. It's kind of the story of humanity. So the people that had the time to write, for example, apologies in defense of Christianity, they're not the cobbler's son. They're what we would refer to as nobility. Does that kind of answer? Or what do you know?
Yeah.
But it's much more imminent, right? I mean, because this is the thing, is that Justin Martyr isn't just doing Christian apologetics because it's a fun intellectual exercise. It's because he, as a Christian, is enduring not just persecution, but the enmity of his neighbors who are thinking that he is an atheist, anti-Roman, et cetera, et cetera. And to make it worse, the emperor, Marcus Aurelius, is saying, and it's unreasonable, it's ridiculous. And this is something that I assume for Justin, and similar for everybody, is something that is core and central to his being. So absolutely, maybe he's not a person of leisure. Maybe he does it, at nighttime after he gets home from working a 12-hour shift or whatever. But he is passionate about this stuff, so passionate that he ends up being arrested and killed for it. And he holds that as a good thing. Okay, 2 more minutes. We didn't get to this, but next week. The celebrity of the martyrs amongst Christianity is one of the other most powerful identity-forming things in the 2nd century of Christianity. You have story upon story upon story. Ignatius was one of the early bishops who gets arrested, and they try to free him. His people try to free him from Roman. And again, it was way different. There's no high security, armored truck with guards. His people could come up and have deep meals with him. He just couldn't leave, right? So his followers are coming up to him and saying, we're going to free you. And he says, no, because if you free me, you take from me the opportunity to die as Christ died, to gain some deeper understanding of what it means to follow Christ. So Ignatius, his student Polycarp is arrested and killed in the same way. That the celebrity of these martyrs who go willingly to their execution, claiming, this is how I better understand the mind of Christ, ends up being an arrow in the quiver of Justin Martyr and the apologists, because you have Marcus Aurelius is saying, look at how crazy these people are. They're so nuts that even when given the rational choice of forsaking this nonsense in order to live, they end up go willingly to the block, right? And Justin Martyr says, no, it's because we believe so passionately about it and because it's the right thing. That's the only reasonable thing to do, is to go, right? Because it means that much. Crazy stuff. All right.